Okay, so one thing you need to know about post-bop is that post-bop is weird. By the mid-1960s, the rise of free jazz had shaken the very foundation of jazz. So mainstream jazz had to somehow find a way to respond to the avant-garde, and that response was a genre called post-bop. Now, post-bop mixes elements of bebop, hard-bop, modal, and free jazz without necessarily being any one of those styles. And post-bop was more or less invented by Miles Davis's second great quintet, so a lot of what I'm going to say here relates directly to this group. Now, I've got a separate video on free jazz which you can watch, but essentially free jazz was a reaction to traditional tonal jazz like bebop. So traditional tonal jazz used diatonic chords, functional chord progressions, and was in a diatonic key. So you had chord progressions like a 2-5-1 in a particular key that used diatonic chords all from one particular key, and the dominant generally led down to the tonic chord. Traditional jazz was also generally in 4/4 time and with a swing rhythm. And it used standard song forms like a 12-bar blues or a 32-bar AABA song form, or some other form that was generally a multiple of 4 bars, so 12 or 16 or 32 bar songs. It also used standard turnarounds like a 3-6-2-5 at the end of a song to bring you back to the start of the song for the next go round. And traditional jazz generally used a head solo head overall structure, where the head is just the melody played over the chord progression. The solo is an improvisation over that same exact chord progression just repeated, and then ending with the head again, that is, with the melody over the chord progression. Now, free jazz was a reaction to traditional tonal jazz. And free jazz often used no chords at all and no chord progressions, and often used atonality. It was often also played in A meter, that is, not in any discernible or distinguishable time signature or meter. It was sometimes played rubato, that is, slowing down and speeding up however you liked. And it involved a lot of polyrhythms. And free jazz often didn't have a fixed form or structure. Songs often had no discernible bar lines or no obvious structure with no parts or sections that you could readily identify. And often it was pure improvisation, that is, it didn't have a head, it was just pure solo, like a lot of the collective improvisation that came out of free jazz. And so if free jazz was a reaction to traditional or your more mainstream jazz, then post-bop was how the mainstream jazz responded to free jazz. And the way that post-bop responded to this attack by free jazz was with ambiguity. Songs were written that were harmonically ambiguous, metrically and rhythmically ambiguous, and formally ambiguous. So post-bop uses non-traditional or weird harmonies, like a C major 7 sharp 5, natural 5, or an A minor major 7 on C sharp, which is the major 3rd, or a C major 7 flat 7, or a C major 7 sharp 9. Right, those are all weird, non-traditional chords. So post-bop chords were often very weird and not necessarily diatonic chords. They often used polychords and used unavailable tensions over particular chords. Post-bop also made use of non-diatonic, non-functional chord progressions. That is, chord progressions with no obvious key and no obvious tonal center. And it also made use of non-diatonic keys, for example, writing a song in the key of the whole tone scale. Post-bop made use of irregular and mixed meters. For example, you could have a song that started in 4/4 but changed to 5/4, or started in 6/4 but changed to 4/4. It made use of polyrhythms, and it made use of both swing and straight rhythms. Post-bop also used non-standard or irregular song forms and moved away from that head solo head structure. So it changed the head by giving odd bar structures, like you could have an 11-bar song. Or you could have a circular progression, where you can't tell where the song ends and repeats. It sort of just sounds like it keeps continuing on a straight line forever. It also suppressed the melody and the chords during the head. And songs were often written without a written out melody or without a written out chord progression. Post-bop also changed how the solo was performed, and as I said before, really moved away from that head solo head structure. And it did this by changing the way that improvisation was integrated into the song. So you don't have clear sections where the melody is played here, the solo is played here, and the melody is played here again. It sort of mixed the melody and the solo in throughout the entire song. So it's no longer segregated bits. It's bits of melody and bits of improvisation sort of all over the place, just mixed into the whole song. And this was done by restating the melody between solos or using fragments of the melody within the solo and using a lot of motivic improvisation or motivic development. And in fact, getting rid of improvisation altogether so that only the melody was played again and again and again without any solo or improvisation in between. And they also altered the chord progression during the solo. So it wasn't just the same chord progression that you played during the head. It was something different. It was something new. And they did this by doing things like adding sections or tags to the chord progression, or using a completely different chord progression unrelated to the head, or changing the existing chord progression in certain ways, or using something called time no changes. So in effect, post-bop sits halfway between free jazz and tonal jazz, so that if free jazz was complete freedom, post-bop is controlled freedom. So post-bop breaks some musical rules, but retains others, and still maintains much more structure and form than free jazz. But nevertheless, post-bop did take some elements and ideas from free jazz, but also retained others from traditional jazz. So then, just to reiterate again, traditional jazz used standard diatonic chords and functional progressions, while free jazz used no chords and no chord progressions. So post-bop used non-diatonic, non-functional chord progressions, which created some harmonic ambiguity. Traditional jazz used a simple 4/4 time signature with a swing rhythm, while free jazz used A-meter and polyrhythms. So post-bop used irregular and mixed meters with polyrhythms, so created a bit of metric and rhythmic ambiguity. And traditional jazz used standard head forms that were usually multiples of 4 bars, and a standard head solo head overall form, while free jazz had no fixed form whatsoever. So post-bop had odd bar structures and forms and moved away from that head solo head overall form, and therefore was a little bit formally ambiguous. So then all these things are designed to create harmonic, metric, rhythmic and formal ambiguity, so that you can't tell what key a song is in, or where the tonal center is, or how many bars there are, or whether it's an AA-BA form, or whether they're improvising or it's actually part of the melody, or what meter the song's in, or what scale they're using. But it's nevertheless less free than free jazz, because it still does have bars, it still does have a fixed form, it still has a given melody, it still has a written out chord progression and a particular time signature. These things exist, they're just unusual, irregular and ambiguous. Whereas free jazz does not have these things at all. And this is what I mean by post-bop being controlled freedom. There is an underlying structure, it's just hidden and vague and ambiguous. Now each of these topics deserves its own video, so this lesson is just a quick summary of what post-bop is, how it arose and its general features. And I'll create a separate lesson for each of these topics where I can go into them in a little bit more depth. But as an example, let's take a quick look at a post-bop song written by Wayne Shorter called Veneta. Right, so that song used non-traditional harmony, or also known as weird chords. It had an E major 7 flat 5, which is an interesting chord. It had an A flat major 7 sharp 5 sharp 9, which is a weird chord because major 7s don't usually have sharp 9s. And it actually had a natural 5 in the melody. So that in the end you end up with this weird polychord of a G augmented over an A flat augmented. It also used an E flat diminished 9, but had the minor 7 in the melody. Right, so all of those are weird chords and weird chord choices for this particular melody. The song also has a non-diatonic, non-functional chord progression. That is, looking at the chords, you can't tell what key it's in or whether it has a tonal center. Right, there's no obvious tonic chord. Each chord is from a different key and none of them really seem to relate to each other in any obvious way, like there are no 5 ones. It's got an odd head form, that is, the actual song is 14 bars long, which is not a multiple of 4 like you find in traditional songs, so it's not 12 bars or 16 bars or 32 bars. It also uses an irregular mixed meter, that is, it's in 4/4 time, but for 1 bar it changes to 5/4. And it's slightly circular, that is, you can't really tell where the end is and where the beginning is. And this is because there's no tonic chord and there's no turnaround to take you back to the start. So then if I just continued playing that song again and again without showing you the lead sheet, you wouldn't really know where the start was and where the end was. And if you listen to the improvisation on the actual recording, you'll hear that they often play fragments of the melody during the improvisation. So it's not really a clear head solo head form. Right, so that's a weird song. It's a weird structure with weird chords and a weird chord progression. And that's what I meant when I said that post-bop is weird. It straddles that grey area between traditional jazz and free jazz. So, like I said before, in the next few videos I'll go through all the concepts I mentioned before in a little bit more detail, because they certainly warrant closer inspection as they're all quite interesting and they're actually quite fun to use in your own playing. And it's also worth noting that the line between post-bop and free jazz is fuzzy. John Coltrane, for example, sat on both sides of the fence. It's sometimes quite hard to classify his music. It's often a mix of modal jazz and free jazz and post-bop. Now, I've written a few post-bop albums you can check out up here in the picture-in-picture. And when you're listening to them, keep in mind Frank Zappa's infamous quote that jazz isn't dead, it just smells funny, because you'll soon understand what he meant. Cool, so thanks for watching again, and as always, please feel free to leave a comment or a question. And look forward to the next few videos where I cover all of these concepts in a little bit more detail. Thanks guys, see ya.